the first thing I remember is the weight. Not the weight of the decision, not the weight of my guilt, but the physical, suffocating weight of the wedding dress. Layers of silk and tulle and lace, a beautiful, expensive cage meticulously crafted for me. I stood before a floor-to-ceiling mirror, a stranger staring back. My hair was an intricate masterpiece of curls and pins, my makeup a flawless mask. The pearl-encrusted bodice was so tight I could barely draw a full breath, and each shallow gasp felt like a betrayal of the self I was about to entomb. My mother's tears of joy, my father's proud, slightly watery smile, they were the final bricks in the wall. Mark, my fiancé, had looked at me an hour ago with such uncomplicated adoration, and all I could feel was the cold prickle of dread on my skin. He was a good man. That was the terrible, inescapable truth of it. He was kind, stable, and handsome, and the thought of a life with him felt like reading a pre-written script for a play I had never auditioned for. My hands, clad in delicate lace gloves, trembled as I smoothed them over the impossibly white skirt. This was it. The pinnacle. The happy ending everyone had worked so hard to secure. And then, through the whirlwind of pre-wedding chaos, a single, clear image pierced through the panic. Her. Alara. The one my mother had dismissively called my eccentric artist friend. She had slipped into the room earlier, a quiet storm in a simple, dark blue dress that seemed to absorb all the false light in the room. While everyone else fussed, she had simply stood by the window, her presence a silent anchor. Before she left, she had walked over to me, her gaze holding mine in the mirror. She didn't offer empty congratulations. Instead, she reached out and tucked a single, deep purple anemone into my bouquet, her fingers brushing mine. A shockwave of pure, undiluted clarity. Her touch was a question, and my entire being screamed the answer. That single, stolen moment of contact unraveled me. The memory of her touch, the look in her eyes that said she saw me, not the bride, but the trapped woman inside the finery, became the only real thing in the room. The carefully constructed facade of my life cracked. I couldn't do it. I wouldn't. The thought was no longer a quiet, shameful whisper in the dark of night. It was a roar, a primal scream from the very core of my being. My heart wasn't just pounding. It was trying to beat its way out of my chest, out of this room, and towards her. I met Alara 2 months before the wedding, a last-ditch effort by my maid of honor to inject some authenticity into the cookie-cutter proceedings. You need a real florist, Clara had insisted, not some corporate event planner. Someone who understands soul. Alara's studio was a converted garage, a chaotic, beautiful jungle of greenery and blossoms. The air was thick with the scent of earth and jasmine. And there she was, standing at a wooden work table, her hands deep in a bucket of deep blue delphiniums, her forearms dusted with soil and pollen. She had a way of moving that was both deliberate and utterly fluid, as if she were in conversation with the plants themselves. She looked up as I entered, and her eyes, the color of moss after rain, seemed to look directly through my carefully curated pleasantries. I was the society bride-to-be, encased in a cashmere sweater set and pearls, but she didn't seem to see any of that. She saw the tension in my shoulders, the way my smile didn't quite reach my eyes. We spoke of color palettes and seasonal availability, but the real conversation was happening in the spaces between our words. Her fingers, as she showed me a velvety petal, were long and capable with short, clean nails. I found myself imagining what they would feel like against my skin, a thought so startling and unbidden I felt a flush creep up my neck. She wasn't like anyone in my world. She was quiet, but her silence was profound, not empty. She listened with her whole body, her head tilted, her gaze unwavering. When our hands brushed as she passed me a sprig of eucalyptus, a jolt went through me, so sharp and sweet it stole my breath. It was the first time a touch had ever felt like a discovery. I started inventing reasons to visit the studio. I needed to check on the progress of the centerpieces, I'd say. I had a new idea for the bouquets. It was all a lie. I was a moth drawn to her particular, brilliant flame. One rainy afternoon, I found her alone, painting a watercolor of a wilted rose. The vulnerability in the image, the beauty she found in decay, undid me. The studio was quiet except for the drumming of rain on the corrugated metal roof. I started talking, not about weddings or flowers, but about the heavy, leaden feeling that had taken root in my chest, the fear that I was building a life on a foundation of sand. I told her about the dreams I'd abandoned for a more sensible career, the way my laughter had become measured and polite, the deep, hollow ache of loneliness that persisted even when Mark held my hand. I told her things I had never voiced to him, to my parents, to anyone. She didn't offer advice or platitudes. She just listened, her presence a quiet sanctuary, her eyes never leaving my face. When I finally fell silent, tears streaking my carefully applied makeup, she simply reached out and wiped a tear away with her thumb. The gesture was so intimate, so tender, it felt like a promise. That was our first kiss. It wasn't planned. It was inevitable. I leaned in, and she met me halfway, her lips soft and tasting of mint and a hint of earth. It was a kiss that felt less like a beginning and more like a homecoming, a key turning in a lock I hadn't known existed. Our secret world became my reality. The wedding planning became a ghostly pantomime I performed, while my true life was lived in the stolen hours with Alara. We met in her studio, the scent of blooms and her skin becoming the only perfume I craved. We met in quiet parks at dusk, our fingers laced together on a bench as the world turned blue around us. We sat in the cocoon of her small car, the windows fogged, sharing stories and silences that were more profound than any conversation I'd ever known. Every touch was a rebellion. Her hand finding mine under a cafe table, her head resting on my shoulder as we watched the sunset, the way she would brush my hair back from my face. These small acts were a language that spoke louder than any vow I was preparing to recite. But the outside world had sharp, demanding edges. The wedding invitations were mailed, thick, creamy cardstock that felt like sentencing papers. The dress was fitted, the seamstress pinning me into my future. My parents' excitement reached a fever pitch, their conversations a constant litany of table settings and guest lists. The weight of my double life became crushing. One evening, a week before the wedding, I broke down in Alara's studio. I was hysterical, sobbing about the 200 guests, the thousands of dollars spent, the irrevocable shame and disappointment I would bring upon my family. I was trapped. There was no way out. The walls of the life I'd built were too high, too thick. Alara held me until my tears subsided, her hands stroking my back in slow, steady circles. Then, she took my face in her hands, her expression fierce and unwavering. "There is always a way out," she whispered, her voice low and certain. "You just have to be brave enough to take it." And then she laid out a plan, simple and insane and terrifying. She wouldn't ask me to choose her. She would simply be there, with an escape route, if I chose myself. A bag packed with my own comfortable clothes, not the costumes of my old life. A car parked a block from the church, gassed up and ready. A destination unknown, a cottage in the woods where we could just be. It was a lifeline thrown into my churning sea, and the mere existence of it calmed the storm inside me. It meant I had a choice, the most terrifying and empowering choice of my life. Quick reminder, if you're enjoying this story, hit subscribe to Sapphic Tales so you don't miss the next one. The morning of the wedding, I was a ghost in my own body. I went through the motions, the hair, the makeup, the dressing, all while feeling like I was observing myself from a great distance. My heart was a wild, frantic bird beating against its cage. Every smile I gave my bridesmaids felt like a lie. Every happy tear my mother shed felt like a drop of acid on my skin. When I looked at my reflection in the mirror, all I could see was the purple anemone in my bouquet, a splash of defiant, vibrant color in a sea of sterile white. It was her flag, planted in the heart of my surrender. The organ music began, a thunderous, triumphant sound that vibrated through the floor and up through the soles of my satin shoes. The massive wooden doors of the church began to swing open. A sea of faces turned towards me, a collective gaze of expectation and joy. At the end of the impossibly long aisle, Mark stood, beaming, looking like everything a bride could ever want. My father tucked my hand into the crook of his arm, his grip firm and proud. We took the first step, then the second. Each one was an agony. The walls seemed to close in, the air grew thin. This was it, the point of no return. And then I saw her, just a glimpse in the very last pew, nearly hidden in the shadows. Alara. She wore a simple trench coat, her hands shoved in her pockets. She wasn't looking at the spectacle. She was looking only at me. Her gaze was a clear, steady beacon in the suffocating fog of the ceremony. It wasn't a look of pleading or demand. It was a look of unwavering faith. A look that said, "I am here. Your life is yours. Choose it." Just a quick pause. If you're enjoying this, hit that subscribe button and stay with us here on Sapphic Tales. A strange, powerful calm descended upon me. The panic vanished, replaced by a crystal uncertainty. My feet stopped moving. My father took another step, tugged gently on my arm, and found me rooted to the spot. I looked at him, at his confused, smiling face, and I slowly, deliberately, pulled my hand from his arm. I saw the moment his smile faltered, the moment confusion turned to dawning horror. I didn't look at Mark. I couldn't. My eyes were locked with Alara's. I let go of the heavy bouquet. It fell to the stone floor with a soft, rustling thud, a splash of color on the gray. And then I ran. I gathered the layers of my ridiculous, beautiful dress in my fists and I ran. Gasps and murmurs rippled through the church, swelling into a wave of shocked confusion. I heard my mother's sharp, panicked cry of my name. I didn't look back. I pushed through the heavy doors, bursting out into the startlingly bright daylight. A sleek, dark car was idling at the curb, just as she promised. The passenger door swung open. I didn't hesitate. I flung myself inside, the voluminous dress stuffing itself into the footwell, and the door slammed shut. Elara's hands were on the wheel, her knuckles white, but her voice was steady as she met my wild, terrified, exhilarated gaze. "Ready?" she asked. I could only nod, my breath coming in ragged, disbelieving sobs as she pulled away from the curb, leaving my old life receding in the rearview mirror. We drove for hours, first on highways, then on winding back roads that snaked through rolling hills. I stared out the window, watching the familiar world of manicured suburbs and shopping plazas give way to forests and open fields. I had stopped crying. Now I was just numb, trembling with the aftershocks of my nuclear decision. The weight of the dress was now a symbol of my freedom, but it was still heavy, the fabric crumpled and stained with grass from my sprint to the car. I finally reached down and, with fumbling fingers, managed to unstrap the delicate satin heels, kicking them off onto the floor mat. The feeling of my bare feet on the car's carpet was shockingly, profoundly real. Elara didn't push for conversation. She just drove, one hand on the wheel, the other resting on my knee, a solid, grounding pressure. After a while, I reached over and turned on the radio, finding a station playing soft, instrumental music. It filled the space without demanding anything from us. I watched the landscape change, the tightness in my chest gradually easing with every mile we put between us and the church. I was adrift, but I was not alone. She was my anchor and my sail. As dusk began to paint the sky in shades of violet and orange, Elara pulled into the driveway of a small, secluded cottage nestled in a grove of pine trees. It was hers, a family retreat she rarely used. She cut the engine, and the silence that followed was absolute and profound, broken only by the whisper of the wind in the tall pines. She turned to me, her face illuminated by the dashboard's soft glow. Without a word, she leaned over and began the delicate work of unpinning the delicate veil from my hair. Her fingers were gentle, carefully extracting each pin. When the last one was removed, she lifted the veil away and tossed it into the back seat. It was a small, symbolic act, but it felt like she was removing a shroud. Inside the cottage, she didn't turn on the main lights, only a small lamp that cast a warm, golden pool in the center of the living room. The air smelled of pine needles and old books. She turned to me, her eyes soft. "Let's get you out of this," she murmured, her voice a balm. She guided me to the center of the room and turned me around. Her fingers found the long line of tiny pearl buttons that ran down my back. Each slow, deliberate unfastening was a release. With each button, I felt a layer of expectation, of performance, fall away. The bodice loosened. I could finally take a full, deep, shuddering breath. She helped me step out of the heavy gown, letting it pool on the floor at my feet, a puddle of a forgotten life. Standing there in just my simple silk slip, I felt more exposed, more naked than I ever had in my life, but also more real. Elara didn't move. She just looked at me, her gaze holding all the warmth and safety I had been craving my entire life. I stepped over the dress, closing the small distance between us, and reached for her. Our third kiss was nothing like the first two. It was not a discovery or a promise. It was a confession. It was slow and deep and tasted of salt from my tears and the profound relief of finally being found. My hands came up to frame her face, while hers slid around my waist, pulling me flush against her, solid and real and everything. If it kept you hooked, subscribe now to Sapphic Tales so you never miss the next. That night, in the quiet darkness of her bedroom, we learned each other by touch and whispered breath. There was no urgency, only a slow, reverent exploration. Her hands, those artist's hands I had admired from the first day, traced the map of me, the curve of my spine, the sensitive skin of my stomach, the beating pulse at my throat. She touched me as if I were a precious, fragile thing, and yet her touch made me feel stronger than I ever had. When her hand slid under the thin silk of my slip, her palm warm against the small of my back, I gasped, my walls crumbling not with force, but with a tenderness I didn't know I was allowed to have. Right there, I whispered into the skin of her neck as her fingers traced the vertebrae, and she hummed in response, her body aligning with mine in a perfect, instinctual sync. We moved together in the quiet dark, a slow, rising tide of sensation and emotion until we crested that wave together, our breaths mingling, our hearts hammering a frantic, synchronized rhythm against each other's chests. She unraveled me, and in the unraveling, I was remade. Afterwards, she pulled the thick, soft quilt over us. I lay with my head on her chest, listening to the steady, strong rhythm of her heart begin to slow. Her fingers traced idle, soothing patterns on my bare shoulder. In the profound quiet, I spoke the fear that had lingered in the back of my mind since the moment I ran. They must all hate me, I whispered into the darkness. I felt her breath against my hair. They might be hurt. They might be confused, she said, her voice a low rumble beneath my ear. But this isn't about them. This is about you choosing to breathe. You can't live your life for the fear of someone else's hatred. Her words didn't erase the guilt, but they placed it in a new context, one where my own survival was not a selfish act, but a necessary one. We fell asleep tangled together, and I woke with the dawn, pale light filtering through the pine branches outside the window. I was still in her arms, our limbs entwined, our breathing synced. I didn't move. I just watched her sleep, the peaceful slackness of her face, the dark fan of her lashes against her cheeks. In this quiet, stolen morning, the enormity of what I had done finally settled over me, but it wasn't a crushing weight. It was a blanket, a shelter. I had chosen chaos, yes, but I had chosen it to find this profound, unshakable peace. Just a quick pause. If you're enjoying this, hit that subscribe button and stay with us here on Sapphic Tales. We spent days in that cottage, wrapped in a bubble of newfound intimacy. We talked for hours, our whispered conversations the only sound besides the wind in the pines. I told her about my childhood, my fears of never being enough, the deep, aching loneliness I had felt even in a room full of people. She told me about her own struggles, her decision to walk away from a conventional path to pursue her art, the quiet judgment she faced. We built a new foundation, not on shared interests or social obligations, but on the raw, unvarnished truth of who we were. We cooked simple meals together in the small, rustic kitchen, our hips bumping companionably as we moved between the stove and the counter. I learned that she was messy with spices, but precise with a knife, that she hummed old folk songs when she was concentrating. We walked through the woods, her hand firmly clasping mine, our silence more comfortable than any conversation I'd ever had. We found a small, ice-cold stream and sat on its bank, dipping our toes in the shocking water, our laughter echoing in the quiet grove. On the third day, she produced a simple, worn leather journal and a set of pencils. "For you," she said, "in case you have words you need to get out." That small gift felt more meaningful than any piece of jewelry I had ever received. The world I left behind tried to reach me. My phone, buried in the bag she had packed, buzzed and vibrated, a frantic, angry insect on the nightstand. I saw my parents' numbers, Mark's, a dozen others, flashing on the screen. After 2 days of this digital haunting, I picked it up. I didn't answer any of the calls. I simply powered it down, the screen going black and silent. The act felt final, like cutting the last tether. I wasn't their daughter, their fiancée, their friend in that moment. I was just a woman in a quiet cottage in love with another woman. It was the only identity that had ever truly fit. On our last morning at the cottage, I woke before her. I slipped out of bed, pulling on one of her soft flannel shirts that smelled overwhelmingly of her, and I went outside to sit on the porch steps. The air was cold and clean, mist rising from the forest floor. I watched the sun break through the trees, dappling the ground in gold. I thought about the church, the dropped bouquet, the gasps. The memory was still sharp, but the pain had been cauterized by the absolute rightness of where I was now. Alara found me there a little while later, 2 steaming mugs of coffee in her hands. She handed one to me and sat beside me, her shoulder pressing against mine. We drank our coffee in silence, watching the world wake up. It was the most sacred morning of my life. It has been a year since I ran. The world did not end. The shame I feared never came because the joy I found was so much louder. Alara and I live in a small apartment above her studio, which is now our studio. I discovered a talent for photography, for capturing the fleeting, fragile beauty of her floral arrangements. Our life is built not on grand gestures, but on small, perfect moments. The smell of coffee and paint in the morning, the way she hums when she works, the feel of her foot brushing against mine under our shared desk, the way we still reach for each other in the middle of the night, a silent reassurance that we are both still there. Sometimes, the ghost of my old life visits me. I'll see a wedding announcement in the paper or catch a whiff of a particular perfume, and a flicker of that old panic will rise. But then Alara will walk into the room, her hands smelling of earth, her smile just for me, and the ghost vanishes. She will come up behind me as I work, wrapping her arms around my waist, resting her chin on my shoulder, and whisper, "My brave, beautiful runaway." And I know, with a certainty that roots me to the earth, that I didn't run away from anything. I ran towards the messy, unpredictable, breathtakingly beautiful truth of my own heart. I ran towards the scent of jasmine and soil, towards the feel of flannel and the taste of mint, towards the quiet understanding in a pair of moss-green eyes. I ran towards her, and in her arms I finally came home. If it kept you hooked, subscribe now to Sapphic Tales so you never miss the next.